Tomas Sandell grunnlegger og direktør for lobbyorganisasjonen European Coalition for Israel. Han utdannet med mastergrad i statsvitenskap ved universitetet og jobbet som pastor, journalist og lobbyist. Han var med å etablere den europeiske bønnefrokosten i Brüssel i 1997. Og han grunnla den organisasjonen European Coalition for Israel i 2003. Han arbeider med base i Helsinki, med virksomhet i både Brüssel og i New York. Velkommen, Tomas Sandell.
Thank you, and to be coherent, I will actually continue in English, although my mother tongue is Swedish. Ambassador, Excellencies, dear friends, Dag and Bjarte, and very good friend Jürgen, that I have worked together with for many years, so good to see you here and strong. It's a special pleasure to be in Norway today, and let me just start by making something clear. I do have something against the Norwegian people, but only one thing. You are too fast on skis. And we were discussing coming in the car with Dag about the relay skiing in Lahtis right now, and I was very interested to see what would happen. Not who would win, because that we all know, it's always Norway, but I said, you know, there's always a silver medal and a bronze medal, so we still have something to compete for in Finland. Having said that, I am from Helsinki, I'm a Finn. But I didn't come here to speak about skiing or Norway, but to speak about Israel and the diplomatic challenges facing Israel and the Jewish people today. But also, I hope, how we, as a Nordic region, can become a community of pro-Israel nations. My dream is really that the Nordic nations would one day become just as successful in being supporters of Israel as we are in skiing. And you know, the last relay, in the women's relay, it was well, can you remind me? Finland, I think. Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And this is how I would like to see it in the future when it comes to nations that are standing up strongly in the international arena, in the United Nations, those who are members of the European Union and elsewhere in the world. When we speak about the challenges facing the Jewish people and Israel today, it's easy to make a distinction, to differentiate. And we see this often in the European debate. People may say, on the one hand, I am a friend of the Jewish people, I condemn anti-Semitism, but on the other hand, I think that Israel is a nation state which is should be criticized and does not live up to its human rights standards. And I think it's, while it's not politically correct today to be an old-fashioned anti-Semite, you cannot say today and get away with it, I dislike the Jewish people. You can still get away by being overly critical, unproportionally critical of the Jewish state. And I think this is a serious problem. In my work, I attend a lot of political meetings. I recall on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I was at a large gathering when this was being highlighted in Prague, and I met a very prominent EU leader. I won't mention his name. I presented myself and I said, this is my name and I come from European Coalition for Israel. And his answer was, and what does Israel has to do with any of this? This was the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. What does Israel has to do with any of this? And I could continue and be even more critical, even as the European Parliament each year honors the victims of the Holocaust. And the state of Israel is nowhere to be seen. And my very good friend, the new ambassador, Ronny Leshnoyar, was seated among the diplomats, just like any diplomat, be it Finland, be it Botswana, be it China. And I think this is something where we need to hold the European leaders accountable. The state, the Jewish state, has everything to do with the faith of the Jewish people. Let us also be clear that when we speak about anti-Semitism, it is true that individual Jews living in Norway, living in Europe, cannot be blamed for whatever action of the Israeli government. That is true. But it doesn't hinder the fact that if it wasn't for the fact that there is a Jewish state today, in 2017, the Jewish people would be no safer today than what they were in 1938. If we would have had a Jewish state in 1938, which was the plan of the Mandate for Palestine, to affirm the right of the Jewish people to their own nation state, and for the British people to make sure that this would come into fruition, millions of Jewish people would be alive today. And I often ask myself, how many new inventions, maybe the inventions to AIDS, to cancer, to this and that, died in the gas chambers of the death camps of the Nazis. So we have all the reasons today, those of us who are friends of the Jewish people, to be also very proud friends of the only Jewish state in the world, the modern state of Israel. We know that, again, if there had been a Jewish state in 1938, there would have been a place for the Jewish people, the Jewish refugees, to go when all the other countries shut their doors. There would have been one air force in the world which would not have hesitated when they knew from intelligence what was happening in Auschwitz and elsewhere, when they knew exactly where the railroad tracks would go, when they knew what it would have taken just to bomb the railroad tracks. But there was no Israeli Air Force at that time, and therefore the greatest tragedy on European soil ever could take place. On the 27th of January, I was in the studio of the European Parliament in Brussels. 27th of January is the Remembrance Day, the victims of the Holocaust. And we were discussing the lessons of history, the lessons of Holocaust, with the EU coordinator against anti-Semitism. There is finally, after so many years, a coordinator who is working only on one portfolio, and that is to step up the fight against anti-Semitism in Europe. And she said, she's a German, she said, still today, more than 70 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, Jewish people live in fear in Europe. And they wonder if they have a future. This is a reality. This is a reality in Sweden, this is a reality in Norway, this is a reality in particular in countries like France and Belgium, in cities like Brussels and Paris. I think for the first time, maybe in 2,000 years, there is a clear danger that Europe would lose its Jewish population altogether. Let us be crystal clear, Europe without the Jewish communities would no longer be Europe. And as our brother mentioned here, all the many great contributions throughout the history and still today that the Jewish people are to us as Gentile nations would no longer be there. But by the way, the United Nations have a new Secretary General. He gave his first speech in January, that's just 2 months ago, and he said something very interesting, talking about BDS. He said, as a Portuguese, I know that the decline of Portugal started the day when they kicked out the Jewish people. Equally, you can say that the economic golden age of the Netherlands started the day when the Jews were kicked out of Spain and Portugal and had to settle in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. This should be a lesson for everyone today that are promoting BDS. Let me quickly go through what I see as the greatest challenges for the Jewish people in Europe today. It's obvious the first challenge, the source of anti-Semitism. It should be said, and without any apologies, that radical Islam in Europe today is a growing challenge for Jewish life. Just last week, we heard about almost a casual incident in Paris, where two Jewish brothers were stopped, attacked, and almost killed by a father and a son, simply because they were Jewish. Exactly a year ago, Jewish community leaders in Europe were suggesting that the time has come where we cannot wear a kippah anywhere in public places in Europe because of fear of our safety and security. It's interesting to note that in 2015, when we had a huge influx of immigrants into Europe, and mainly, to a large extent, immigrants from Muslim communities, we had a reverse migration. And the only people group that were leaving Europe in 2015 in record numbers were the Jewish people. And this is something that we very often forget. Neo-fascism, neo-Nazism is not dead. And someone, a German, actually pointed out the fact that maybe the merger of, on the one hand, radical Islam and different forms of neo-Nazism is an emerging power that were established, we know, during the 1940s, when the Grand Mufti sat down with Hitler. And this is something that we should be very concerned about. You have countries like Greece, Hungary, Bulgaria, parts of Germany, East Germany, where neo-Nazi parties are represented in the parliament and are openly anti-Semitic. We also know that in France, we have election coming up, and one of the candidates have made statements just in recent weeks to say that it's not compatible with French law to be an Israeli citizen and a French citizen at the same time, and that the Jewish people may have to give up their religious symbols in order to win the battle against Islam. And I think we have all the reasons to be worried. The interesting thing is also that even today you see a merger, a coming together of the most diverse ideologies. So all of a sudden, you have an extreme left and an extreme right. You have a radical Islamist and you have a right-wing neo-Nazi agreeing on one thing. And you know what that thing is, their hatred against the Jewish people. Still, I think there's another form of anti-Semitism, which I would almost call the most dangerous one. And I have chosen to call this sophisticated anti-Semitism. This is the most subtle form of anti-Semitism, often represented by people who would consider themselves to be liberal, to be progressive, but a very clear bias against the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And it's a great paradox that the real reason why we may, and God forbid, end up in a situation where there would no longer be Jewish life in Europe could very well come from this form of society. Why? It's simple. And we have clear examples from the Council of Europe where discussions have been made, draft resolutions have been passed to say that circumcision of male infants should be against the law. It's a human rights violation. It's a violation of a little child. This is barbaric. It cannot continue in sophisticated humanistic Europe. Full stop. And we go on and say the same applies for animals' rights. We cannot accept kosher slaughter anymore. So by defending human rights and in the name of human rights, and God forbid, legislation could be passed to make Jewish life, traditional Jewish life in Europe impossible after 2,000 years of Jewish communities living among us. And this is something that I believe we have to pay attention to. A lot of things have already been said about BDS, about the attempts to boycott and divest and have sanctions against Israeli companies. We see this interestingly, and I think as Christians we have to be very self-critical here. How did BDS grow to become what it is today? I can tell you. The Christian church was one of the largest proponents of BDS in Europe. Together with the trade unions, together with parts of academia, the Christian churches and the Christian humanitarian organizations were at the forefront. I've been in discussions, and as you may understand, I'm often in discussions with EU officials, trying to challenge them on these issues. But they would tell me, you know, listen, we are only officials. We have to listen. We have to put the ear to the ground and say, well, what are the Europeans thinking? And this is what we hear. We never saw, and this is where I feel ashamed, I said, we never saw you, friends of Israel, coming here and presenting your case. What we did see are these large trade unions, organizations of academia, and the established churches. They came and they said, this is the #1 human rights issues that you need to get right. If you need arguments from us, from a Christian perspective, why this is despicable, and why the Jewish state is despicable, why the occupation is despicable, come to us. This is also why we started the European Coalition for Israel, because I just felt this cannot be the case. The day when all these people are to be made accountable, and they would say, well, the Christians, they came to us. This is what they told us. You know, we thought Israel is reasonable, but they said, no, no, no. Israel is, the Jewish people are terrible. I think we need to raise an alternative voice. The good news is, and I just saw this, I think it's 2 Kings, where I think it's an angel that says to Elisha, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. This is the wonderful news. Yes, you can clap. In September, when I had a chance to sit down with the Prime Minister of Israel, I told him exactly this thing. I said there is a small minority which is very vocal, which is very well organized, which is very professional, which is very well funded. I'm telling you, if you want to be a friend of Israel, you will not get 1 penny from the Finnish government, from the European Union, from the United Nations, from the large foundations in the world, not 1 penny. If I would want to become a successful social entrepreneur, I would have to change sides. I could make a very comfortable living just bashing Israel. And this is a disgrace to our governments. This is a disgrace to the European Union and to the United Nations. The good news is that I think that the BDS movement to some extent is losing ground. But it is a very fierce battle. And the university campuses, you know, the places where should be the beacon of light, the beacon of humanism, the beacon of enlightenment, are today filled with hatred. And you know what happened a few months ago in London, and you know what happened again last week, where people wanted to discuss Israel openly, but it's difficult today. And the chairs were starting to flow around, and people got violent and people got aggressive. We have in our organization young adults, young professionals, many of them university students. One in particular, and I do not want to mention her name, she is organizing an event next week in a university in the Netherlands. And she wants to present the issue of Palestinian human rights, but from a slightly different perspective. From the perspective of a lawyer that Jürgen and I know very well, Kalev Myers, who has challenged the Israeli government on a number of issues, but also is an advocate for Israel on this arena. And the university staff, the lecturers, the professors have come to her time and time again and said, please, I beg you, do not go ahead with this lecture. Do not go ahead with this lecture. And you can come up with hundreds of reasons why it's something wrong with the person, his character, where he's from, the way he speaks, or the way he looks. I don't know what it is. But they do not want to hear a different opinion. And this is where the great European civilization came about, at the university. And today, they're becoming ghettos for hatred and bigotry. And this is something that we need to be on our guard for. Let me use the next 9 minutes, perhaps on a more positive note. When I try to motivate people to say why they should be friends of Israel, why they should be vocal friends of Israel, why they should, as Jürgen said, they should have an influence, be it in your family, at your workplace, university, I give them one example, and one example only. And that was the conference in Evian, France in 1938, in July, just after Hitler had annexed Austria, and the question was, what shall we do with all the Jewish refugees who want to come out to Germany? Which nations will receive them? And many of you may be familiar with this conference because the conclusion was so disappointing. Not one single nation, well, the Dominican Republic, to be fair. But apart from that, the nations did not want the Jewish people. And we had the most amazing quotes from Canada. The ambassador of Canada said that Canada is not large enough to receive these few thousand Jewish refugees. And the ambassador of Australia said, well, we don't have any anti-Semitism or racism in Australia, and we don't want to import it either. Can you imagine? Nation after nation. My only point is this. Where was the Christian church at that conference? If you go to Wikipedia today, you can even see the minutes. You can see who were presented there. Not one Christian voice. And I'm telling people when I want to motivate them and challenge them, I said, if we have had a handful of people at that meeting, we could have changed the world. If there would have been a handful of people who would have rather got engaged in July when most people want to be on holiday, perhaps millions of Jews would still be alive today. It doesn't take many to change the world. And we know that from our Christian tradition. Jesus knew that it didn't take many to change the world, to turn it upside down. But we need to stand in the gap. I always ask this question to myself, when is my Evian moment? When is our Evian moment when things will go either way? And when the question will be, well, did we bother to step in? Or were we too intimidated? Were we too afraid? History doesn't repeat itself, so it will probably not be Evian. but I'm sure of one thing, that there will be opportunities again for those who love the Jewish people to make a difference. We have seen this in the European Union in Brussels, where we have an office just around the corner from the European Parliament, that it does make a difference. My ambition and our ambition when we started this work was very simple, and that was that regardless of if we are many or if we are only a few, there need to be that voice which is heard. That voice needs to be heard not only within the four walls of the church, but I always challenge our people and said, what you cannot say, what you can say in your church, but you do not dare to say outside the church, you should never say. I think the facts are on our side. I know 2 years ago you had Dr. Jacques Gauthier speaking here, a good friend that we have worked together with for the last 6 years, where we have been invited to parliaments from Tokyo to Rome to London to Berlin to Washington and to the UN Security Council to present something which was ignored for such a long time, that you can prove the legal rights of the Jewish people to their own state only by consistently arguing out of international law. It has been an amazing adventure to see, as Jürgen said, and I think others said, be it a discussion on a flight or be it in a discussion in the UN Security Council, people say, wow, nobody told me this before. I didn't hear this on CNN, and I didn't hear it, on BBC. But the facts are on our side. We have nothing to be ashamed of. And I think the beauty of being a friend of Israel, as you said, brother, is that we don't have to be an enemy of anyone. We can still have our heads high and say, well, we love the Palestinian people, but we also love and support the right for the Jewish people to live in security and secured borders in their ancestral homeland. I'm getting so excited so I could almost use your 15 minutes, but I'm going to conclude in 3 minutes. And I will conclude by just saying a few words about what is even possible to achieve in the United Nations. When we started approaching the United Nations, of course, we know this is really the lion's den. This is where they hate Israel. This is where everything goes against Israel. But we suddenly, and we believe God gave us a strategy, was to go back to what the international community would define as the basis of international peace, universal peace. It's interesting when you ask a UN diplomat, could you define universal peace? And they would say, wow, I read somewhere this going to turn the swords into plowshares. I think that's a good explanation of what world peace will be like. This is what Ban Ki-moon would always refer to. He said, this is where I find my inspiration. When I go into the United Nations headquarters, through the Isaiah wall in Manhattan, and I read these words from Isaiah 2. What a wonderful opportunity for us to say that, listen, dear diplomats, ambassadors, we are on the same page, we have the same goal, we want world peace, and we even want it the way that you want it, by going to Isaiah 2. And they say, wow, of course, But when you read from Isaiah 2, you read about the nations streaming up to, not New York, to Jerusalem. You read about the nations learning of the ways of the God of Israel, the God of Jacob. And this has led us on a journey where the door is open ambassadors, including the Secretary General, are willing to listen. And sometimes people say, well, show me something very tangible. And we wanted to find a way to bring the nations together on a positive message in the UN. And we came to realize also that the Jewish people, compared to all other faiths, they did not have any of their religious holidays except recognized by the UN. So on Yom Kippur, the most holy day in the Jewish calendar, it was a working day, just like Christmas Eve, would not be the case for us. And we brought this first to the attention of the Israeli government, and we said, do you think this is a good idea? And the minister, he looked at his advice and said, well, why didn't we come up with this idea? They've been members for 65 years. And we said, well, let's embark on this journey and ask the United Nations for just one reasonable thing. And it's funny when you think about it. This is what Moses asked the Pharaoh, to say, let us go out just for a few days to celebrate our holidays. So we said the same thing. Let these Jewish people have one free day in the UN calendar that we honor their tradition. And 3 years of hard work and many luncheons and receptions and meetings with UN ambassadors. Finally, last year was 2016 was the first time that Yom Kippur was recognized as an official UN holiday. And the point in saying all of this is that when you have to shift the focus away from the negative, away from a conflict, and say, as we've heard earlier today, time's up, that you heard earlier today, the Jewish people are a blessing to the nation. They are a light to the nation. And if it wasn't for their contributions throughout history, starting with Isaiah, inspiring for world peace, and still today, the world would be a very dark place. But thank God we have the Jewish people. They now have their own state. And this is something to be celebrated in the international community. Thank you for being able to share my heart and to celebrate Israel here together with you today. Thank you.